Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Thank you all for being here today. We will begin the webinar shortly. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We will wait a few more moments for attendees to arrive and begin the webinar shortly. Thank you. Hello again, and thank you so much for being with us here today for this Stevens Initiative webinar on qualitative evaluation methods. I'm Henry Shepard, Assistant Director of the Stevens Initiative, and it's such a pleasure to be joined by these wonderful colleagues to share this presentation today. Before we get started, I want to point out that you can add your questions to the conversation using the question and answer feature at the bottom of this Zoom video conference. You can type them there anytime during this conversation, and we will get to them and try to bring them up in part of the conversation in the later stages of the webinar. If you want to engage with us through social media, you can tweet at us at StevensInit, so at StevensINIT, and use the hashtag #WorldClassConnection, which is our campaign to raise awareness about virtual exchange. We shared a toolkit this morning through our pre-webinar announcement email to those of you who registered earlier. If you want to follow up and find that resource or any other resources that we've shared as the Stevens Initiative, visit our website, stevensinitiative.org, and go to the resources page. Now I'm so excited to turn the conversation over to our panelists. We're joined by Safa Amer and Jen Laird from RTI International and Miriam Hauk from Open University. And I'd like to turn it over to them and ask them to introduce themselves and their projects. So if you could start off, please, by introducing yourself and just describe the programs that you'll be discussing today in general terms. Who do they serve? How are they conducted?
Great. Hi, my name's Jen Laird. I'm from RTI International. Since 2016, RTI has served as the independent evaluator of the Stevens Initiative. We are a large nonprofit, multidisciplinary research organization with a mission to improve the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. We're headquartered in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, which is in the Raleigh-Durham area. And we have 9 regional offices, US regional offices, and 9 international offices. I work in the Berkeley, California office, and I'm a sociologist by training and have been conducting education program evaluations for about 20 years. I'll turn it over to my colleague Safa to briefly introduce herself, and then I'll describe the programs we're evaluating.
Sure, thank you. And hi, everyone. My name is Safa Amer. I work with Jen at RTI International, but I'm located in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And I joined the Stevens Initiative evaluation team a year ago as a senior statistician evaluator to support the impact evaluation design and analysis of the data.
Great. So I'll now briefly discuss the programs that we're evaluating. As the independent evaluators of the Stevens Initiative, we're tasked with collecting and analyzing data from all of the programs supported by the Stevens Initiative, which so far includes about 24 different virtual exchange programs. What they have in common is that they meet the definition, a Stevens Initiative definition of a virtual exchange, which is that it's an educational tool that utilizes online technology to connect individuals or small groups around the world. It's based on a curriculum that involves qualified facilitators, such as educators, and it involves sustained communication and collaboration in real time or asynchronously. The programs share a broad set of goals of increasing mutual understanding and equipping young people with the skills they'll need to succeed in the 21st century. That includes some key global competencies that the initiative has identified: cross-cultural communication, cross-cultural collaboration, perspective taking. There's a list of them, and they're listed and defined in the toolkit that Henry referenced. Having said that, the programs vary substantially across a number of dimensions. Some have involved middle grade student participants, others secondary school participants, and still others post-secondary participants or young adults not enrolled in school. Some of the programs have been embedded in secondary or post-secondary courses, and others have taken place outside of formal education programs and after school settings at community-based organizations during the summer. Some have occurred in a relatively short period of time, a week or a few weeks, with a lot of intensive time during those weeks, and others span a full semester or even a full year. Their substantive focus have varied greatly. Some have focused on science topics, others have focused on social science topics, and still others on entrepreneurship or citizenship. So we'll be talking today about methods and tools that we've used across what is a very diverse group of virtual exchanges.
Miriam,
okay, I guess it's my turn. Yeah, I'm Miriam Haug. I'm from the Open University in the United Kingdom. I sit here with several hats, I guess. I have been a virtual exchange practitioner, trainer, and researcher for almost 2 decades now, based at the Open University in the United Kingdom, but also for the SUNY Coyle Center, for the Center for Collaborative Online International Learning. I've been the primary investigator and co-investigator in a series of EU Erasmus Plus funded projects and initiatives. And I guess it's mainly in that capacity that you've asked me to join this panel today. The program I'm going to speak to mostly is Evaluate. It just had its capstone conference last week in Leon in the northwest of Spain. Evaluate was about evaluating and upscaling class-to-class virtual exchange in initial teacher education programs across Europe. So it examined the impact on students and teachers, and when we are talking about students, we are talking about teacher trainees, of integrating class-to-class virtual exchange into their programs. It was a European policy experimentation And the aim of policy experimentations is to assess the effectiveness and the potential scalability of innovative policy measures through experimental and semi-experimental approaches. Now, our consortium brought together, and this was an absolute first, public authorities, so representatives from European ministries of education and representatives from universities from a variety of European countries, so myself representing the Open University in the UK. We worked with teacher trainers or teacher educators from 34 different institutions of initial teacher education, and organized virtual class-to-class virtual exchanges, which involved over 1,000 student teachers. In total, institutions of initial teacher education from 16 countries were involved, because we also teamed up with institutions from outside the EU. Now, our overarching research question was, will participation in class-to-class virtual exchange contribute to the development of competences which student teachers need to teach, collaborate, and innovate effectively in a digitalized and cosmopolitan world, and with a particular focus on their intercultural and digital pedagogical competence development through class-to-class virtual exchange.
Thank you all so much. It will be great now to delve a little bit more deeply into the choices you all have made or the systems you've set up to evaluate these programs. So it would be helpful if you could explain the approaches you've taken to evaluation and how those approaches are informed by partnerships, other circumstances of the programs that you've discussed. Maybe I could start with Safa and Jen about the Stevens Initiative programs.
Sure. And so for the program evaluation, we've used a mixed methods approach, which collects or combines that and analyzes data, both qualitative and quantitative together. I know today we will be focusing on the qualitative methods, but I wanted to briefly mention both the quantitative data and the qualitative, especially the quantitative, because it does contribute quite a bit, and both of them are as important for the evaluation. When it comes to the quantitative data, we have two components, if I may say. The first one is more descriptive about demographics of the type of students we have. So it has things like gender distribution, how many were in the middle grade students, secondary versus post-secondary, and the proportion who come from low income versus rural background. So this gives us like a little snapshot of the type of participants we have in the virtual exchange programs. The other component of the quantitative data are surveys that are completed by the participants in the virtual exchange at the beginning and at the end of the virtual exchange program. So we want to see before and after the program to be able to compare how things change over time and what are the contribution and impacts of the program. Most of these are included close-ended survey items, Likert scale, asking questions such as what Jen was talking about, cross-cultural communication, cross-cultural collaboration, perspective taking, knowledge of the other. So we did an extensive literature review to identify the survey scales. We've discussed them with the different awardees, with the Stevens Initiative team, to make sure that the instruments are capturing this information and measuring it adequately to the extent possible. In association with today's webinar, I know that the team at the Stevens Initiative has released a toolkit which describes the evaluation approach we've used in the specific Stevens Initiative evaluation. And these survey scales that I'm talking about are part of the appendices included. In addition to just saying that, I'm not going to go too much in detail here. I acknowledge again the qualitative is a big component of what we're talking about today, but I'm really excited to say that starting this fall, 2 of the awardees are conducting an impact evaluation, a rigorous impact evaluation, in which data is not only collected on the group of students or participants who are part of the virtual exchange, but we're also looking at the comparison group, those who did not participate. And that's supposed to shed a lot of light on the impact of the program and how things are happening within the virtual exchange and outside of the virtual exchange, not only before and after for the group of participants. So excuse my excitement, I had to, to mention that. Otherwise, we used to collect, or some of the program used to collect comparison group, but they're not as planned and organized towards more rigor for the evaluation.
Miriam, could you share with us a little bit more on the approaches and the context in which those choices have been made?
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't make choices in a way because the EU gives very strict guidelines on how it expects these European policy experimentations to be carried out. We also use the mixed method approach. If someone is interested in the details, JPAL Europe 2016 is where those guidelines can be found. We also use the mixed methods approach, quantitative data to measure the development of the students' intercultural and digital pedagogical competences, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And qualitative data is the focus of today's webinar, to answer questions related to why virtual exchange had the impact it did, how it was integrated in the participating institutions, and how the virtual exchange model, class-to-class virtual exchange, how it impacted differently across various socio-institutional contexts. So we used a pre-post design with a control group. In terms of the quantitative data to establish the impact of virtual exchange on the participants' intercultural competence, we drew on a 20-item questionnaire developed and validated by Portala and Jen 2010. And we did this because we had to use established, validated instruments. So the for Tala and Jen 20-item questionnaire to establish the impact of virtual exchange on the participants' intercultural competence. And then we also drew on the technological pedagogical content knowledge work of Köhler and Mishra 2005. And there is a 47-item questionnaire to operationalize their framework that has been developed and validated by Schmidt and his co-authors in 2009, and relies on a response scale of from totally disagree 1 to totally agree 5 for each of the questionnaire items. We also had an 8-item questionnaire pre-post design related to foreign language competence. But foreign language competence was not relevant to all of the exchanges, and it was not the main focus of this policy experimentation. And then to achieve a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the impact of virtual exchange in initial teacher education, we also collected a substantial amount of qualitative research data from the students and the teachers participating in the exchanges. Again, remember, when I talk about students, I talk about teacher trainees. And these qualitative data sources allowed us to answer those questions which cannot be answered by a classic pre-test, post-test method. Now, very quickly, the main sources of qualitative data. We carried out pre- and post-exchange online and on-site interviews with focus groups from the participating classes and the teacher trainers. We used an online learner diary, also online learner diary entries at key stages during the exchange with prompts that focused on the virtual exchange experience itself and how it related to the development of digital pedagogical competences and intercultural competence. And we also used the transcripts of the online interactions, the products, the artifacts created by the participants during the exchange, and we also had a substantial amount of end of exchange reflection documents, mostly in the shape of paragraphs or short essays. And then we also, at the very end, we interviewed the teacher trainers who were running those class-to-class virtual exchanges. As a huge amount of qualitative data, and which meant that we had, in order to do content analysis, we had to use qualitative data analysis software. In our case, we used NVivo, but there are other packages around.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for sharing several of those references. We'll do what we can to relay the details of those references in our follow-up thank you emails for anyone who's interested in learning more about them.
And also to make your life easier, Henry, because the report and the executive summary are downloadable from the evaluate.eu site, and all the references are in there.
Thank you. I think we, if I'm remembering right, we relayed the link to the report in our pre-webinar email, but we'll definitely make sure we follow up as well.
Okay, thank you.
Jen and Safa, can you delve a little bit more into the qualitative methods that you've been using with Stevens Initiative awardees?
Sure. So we collect qualitative data primarily through site visits, which we conduct both in person and virtually. When we do a site visit, there are a number of qualitative methods we use. We conduct a focus group with program participants, typically about 6 to 12 participants. We usually request an hour for that. We also interview the virtual exchange teacher or facilitator. And then we also interview other stakeholders, and those might be a program manager or designer who may not be actually facilitating the exchange, but they help to manage it or they help to design it. Other stakeholders can include folks like a department chair or a university president who's knowledgeable about the project and can speak to how it fits with their institutional goals or not. And then finally, we observe a virtual exchange activity. In terms of the observations, we request that it be an authentic activity, one that the participants would be doing for the program and not scheduled for or organized for the benefit of our site visit. If the program includes synchronous exchange, which most do, and they'll be doing a synchronous exchange during our site visit, we ask to observe that activity. If the program doesn't do synchronous activities or it's not feasible at the time while we're conducting the site visit, we ask to observe an asynchronous activity or to join virtually later during a synchronous activity. Each of those data collection activities are guided by protocols, which we developed specifically for the Stevens Initiative. The interview and focus group protocols are semi-structured with questions that we ask of all programs. And we also encourage our site visitors, which are researchers like Stefan and myself, to ask follow-up questions or pursue lines of inquiry that come up during the focus group or interview that might not be on our list of prepared questions. The Stevens Initiative shortly will be sending a document that includes versions of our protocols and in case they're helpful examples for other programs interested in having an internal or independent evaluator conduct interviews and focus groups with participants and facilitators. In terms of the observations, we also developed a protocol for that, and that guides us in what to look for and note in terms of specific aspects of the activity we're observing. So how many participants involved, how many adult non-participants are present, and what are their roles? What's the activity we're observing? Is it synchronous, asynchronous, and a description of what it is? What's the level of engagement of the participants? Is it high, medium, and low? And we have space to explain our rating. There's a place for us to describe positive elements that we have observed that are supportive of the virtual exchange, as well as challenges and barriers that we observe that the participants are experiencing. And then there's an important section that gives us space to essentially write questions that come up for us during the observation that we want to follow up on, either during the focus group or with the facilitator afterwards, or discuss with our evaluation team. So we found that this combination of data collection activities, focus groups with participants, interviews with facilitators and other stakeholders, observations of activities to be effective because we're able to gather the perspective of multiple stakeholders and also see an activity in action. If we were only to do one observation of an activity, we wouldn't know what came before, what's going to come after. We couldn't check our perceptions of what we think we saw participants learning during the activity, because through the focus groups, we're able to ask them, so what did you think you gained or not during the activity? And oftentimes they'll mention things that we couldn't have observed, we didn't observe directly, and it takes their reflection to gather that dimension as well. We mentioned that we do site visits in person and virtually. We try to conduct a site visit with both partners in exchange. So for example, if a classroom in Chicago is paired with a secondary classroom in Casablanca, we try to conduct site visits with both classrooms. Because traveling for site visits is relatively expensive, we often do one in person and the other virtually. We make sure that we're not doing all of the Stevens Initiative supports virtual exchange programs between youth in the US and the Middle East and North Africa. So we want to make sure that our in-person site visits include a mix of MENA site visits and US site visits.
And if I may add, in terms of once all of this data is collected, for the analysis and reporting, we have two components or two approaches that we mix, and they're driven by supporting an adaptive management protocol. So feedback can go back to the awardees directly in order for them to benefit from it. And also more of a development evaluation strategy. So the first component is really to prepare a brief memo, which is roughly a 2-pager. And this happens soon after conducting these site visits. We send them both to the Stevens Initiative and to the program we visited. In this short memo, we start by summarizing the strengths and challenges we observed during our site visit, and otherwise highlights of the main things we heard from the focus group interviews, and this is where we offer any consideration for program improvement for them to benefit from the site visit and to show appreciation of disturbing their normal day-to-day activities. We typically have 2 site visitors. So one site visitor drafts the memos and consult the interview, focus groups, all of the data we've collected, and the second site visitor reviews the memo, confirming that we both agree on the content and before sending them to the program. The goal of sending these brief memos soon after the site visit is to provide them feedback relatively quickly so that they have a time frame possibility to make any adjustment during the remainder of their program, and or more likely during the next semester they implement the program. So depending on when we visited during the program implementation. The second part of the analysis, and this is related to what Miriam also was talking about, is that with the amount of interviews and qualitative components, there's quite a bit of data that needs to be analyzed. In the UK, they've used in vivo, we use Deduce in order to run the analysis as a qualitative analysis platform. For example, last May, we prepared a report for the Stevens Initiative that represented finding based on 14 in-person or virtual site visit. Each of them had different data collection points, and we had more than 50 sets of notes to code and deduce based on these interviews. It enabled us to quantify some of the data collecting during these site visits, and such as counts of how many programs noted experiencing a particular challenge, because there are lots of things that might end up in common across programs, such as challenges experienced scheduling the virtual exchange sessions, giving the time zone and the school calendar of when these virtual exchanges are happening. We also use the site visit notes that we organized using Deduce to identify and describe promising practices, what worked in some of these virtual exchange programs as lessons learned that could be shared with other programs. Things like how program facilitates meaningful exchange by providing participants with structured opportunities to get to know each other on one-on-one or small groups. So lessons learned from these site visits at a more in depth compared to the memos that gives like a higher level information.
What is the function or the value of these qualitative methods in the context of better understanding the effect of these programs, and in particular the interplay between qualitative methods and quantitative methods as part of a mixed methods approach? And I know that that is a huge question, so if we could just maybe cover the key points and then get into a few more questions before we turn it over to the audience, that would be great.
Okay, I just would like to echo, if I may, the importance of what has been said about the site visits, because in our case, for example, we want virtual exchange to become an integral element of teacher education in Europe, across all higher education institutions in Europe and across the curriculum, because obviously we believe that once the teachers have experienced that, they are more likely to implement it into their teaching practice across the curriculum. Now, very often there are on-site obstacles. That's why the site visits and the interviews with the stakeholders on-site are so important, because these are different sociocultural settings where even within a country, there is a lot of the amount of challenges is sometimes seems unsurmountable, but so we also spoke to internationalization officers and to administrators. And some of the most significant findings, though, from our qualitative data, beyond these interviews with the stakeholders, were that for many students who came from homogeneous backgrounds, virtual exchange was often their first serious engagement with members from another cultural background. This helped to raise their curiosity and openness towards others, and gave many of them the confidence and the motivation to then seek further opportunities to engage with difference and otherness, and further develop their intercultural sensitivities. And they also reported increased confidence in working in international intercultural contexts. All this comes from the qualitative data, So facing and overcoming challenges, they develop teamwork and problem-solving skills, and also increased knowledge of how to use technology in the classroom for international collaboration. So all this, just to wrap up, the value of collecting and evaluating all this qualitative data.
Great. And to go back to your question about the interplay between qualitative and quantitative methods. So as I mentioned earlier, the quantitative data collection is quite a bit of a core of what we do, and quantitative methods are like more systematic, standardized across all programs. There's no wiggle room. These are like surveys, structured with closed-ended questions. They don't allow the researchers to probe further when we observe any out of the norm issue. So if there's an answer that seems extreme, we cannot go beyond and ask why in the quantitative methods and protocols. So they allow us to get standardized data with a certain sample size, to run analysis and to do comparison within and across program participants. However, the benefit of having so qualitative methods, on the other hand, they are more customized, and they allow us to pick lead points and investigate the reasoning, because they are semi-structured. We start by asking questions, but if some of the answers are not usual or require deeper investigation to see what the reasoning about a certain issue, why it's occurring, this is where the qualitative gives us a breathing room as a researcher to add more depth and understanding, yet allowing some contrast across programs. So there's the structure part of it that allows the contrast, but there's also the openness that allows more wiggle room to ask additional questions and probe about issues that are raised. So we get more in-depth understanding, and although the sample size is not big for qualitative methods, considering the amount of coding and analysis that needs to happen at the back end, it's still, when we select those different groups for the qualitative methods, we try to cover a diversity of respondents. So across gender, across different groups, age, and so on, we end up covering the core demographics across all of them. in terms of diversity and making sure that all of their voices are heard and more explanation is provided about issues and challenges and maybe success or failure or less lucky experiences have happened to understand what's driving it and be able to better understand what's going on.
Miriam, would you like to add more about that? Or maybe I could even turn it over to our next, go ahead, sorry.
No, I would totally agree with the value lying in the more comprehensive and the more nuanced understanding of what is going on that quantitative data cannot provide you with. And then, of course, you have the advantage that we've been describing of being able to triangulate that data. And that obviously adds to the validity of our findings.
We're going to turn it over to audience questions in a few moments. So go find the Q&A button at the bottom of the video conference window and type in your questions there. And my colleagues and I will try to pick some good ones to pass along to our panelists. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, I'll ask one more question, which is, what are some of the challenges that arise when using qualitative methods, and how do you balance the challenges or risks of those with the value that they might bring?
Well, you largely rely on self-reported data. That's a disclaimer, and this is what you have to say when you report on that data. That doesn't make it any less valuable, but you have to acknowledge that it's self-reported. And people who know that are part of the research study, they might say different things because they are part of the study. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but it can happen. Okay. Yeah, there are limitations.
Yes, and if I may add also that there is, you try to give the demographics of what kind of respondents to the programs, to the awardees, but at the end of the day, you get those that have been selected by the awardees. So there could be some inherent bias in terms of what we're hearing, which part of the story. We depend on the awardees to give us as much of a diversity, both good and bad, but you never know who's accessible, especially in programs where students are not part of a course and so on, or they moved on after when we go for the site visit. So it gets to be dependent on the mix of students that have been selected to talk to. And I think, Jen, you were trying to say something, sorry.
I wanted to add something, if I just say, because just to clarify, you talked about you using Deduce, and in the UK we used NVivo. We were a whole team of researchers that coded data in different countries. So we worked on one big NVivo project, as it's called. The beauty is that allows you, NVivo, I'm not sure whether that's the case for Deduce, to run matrix queries. And these matrix queries show trends and tendencies. So yes, it is self-reported, but if with the help of matrix queries, you will see whether despite that limitation, you see trends in the answers. That's what I wanted to add. Sorry, Jen, I interrupted.
I mean, I agree with the challenges you mentioned. I'll say collecting qualitative data, particularly through site visits, it's time intensive, and it's both in terms of organizing it. So we start months in advance, whether it's an in-person or a virtual site visit, because there are a number of activities we want to accomplish. So it takes time to introduce the idea of a site visit to the awardees, and then identify an appropriate time in their schedule, both in terms of day of the week, but also in terms of time in the program. You don't want to do it right when they start because they won't have had much experience, and you also don't want to wait to the very end, often because they're busy wrapping up the experience, and often, particularly if they're happening during in a formal education setting, it's often at the end of a semester, so they have finals and papers and all of that. So it's time intensive, both to do and to plan for.
Yeah, and may I add something, Henry? Because in the Evolve project, the evidence validated online learning through virtual exchange, which is kind of the follow-on project to the Evaluate, we use a slightly different approach now. It is time consuming, but it has already proven invaluable. The first pilot iteration has already shown that what we call the collaboratory, where we help the implementers, the virtual exchange implementers, that is the teachers again, to become researchers of their own virtual exchange practice while they're implementing virtual exchanges is the way forward. So you work as a research team in collaboration with those who are doing it on the ground and help them, give them parameters against which they can map and evaluate what's happening. New approaches evolve.
You've managed to connect 3 of the top questions we've received so far. How can people do this with limited resources? How can people with limited resources get a real understanding of the journey that their students are going on? Maybe those are just 2 key questions. Can you say more about this new method that you've started using that will help explain this?
So we call it the collaboratory. That's the approach. So we train people, teachers across the curriculum, colleagues, I wanted to say, to design and implement a virtual exchange. We help them find virtual exchange partners for class-to-class virtual exchange. But part of the training is also to become a researcher of your own practice and to research this with us together. Not just them generating data that then we, the researchers, do something with, but they research their own virtual exchange practices together with us. So we share the data and we analyze the data together with them. So in this way, we also want this approach of evaluating virtual exchange to become more scalable and people not depending on us, the professional researchers, to do what we call exploratory practice.
So if someone is on this webinar and their interest is piqued by this, they themselves want to become active in their own involvement in such a collaboration, are there any further resources to learn more about this or to adapt this?
Join us. The Evolve project is up and running. We have a website. You can join us. We have the next iteration of training starting on October 15th.
Is it open to educators outside of the Euromed region?
Yes.
Okay.
It
Very
is.
helpful.
You're welcome.
Let's just hypothesize that we're talking about virtual exchange implementers at the K-12 level, so outside the scope of the Evolve program. What advice would you all have for people who want to be using qualitative methods but are recognizing that they can be time intensive?
Well, one of the things is to start a consideration also, since we're talking about K through 12, you have to keep in mind the parental consent and access to these students. So that's something to start with, to make sure that you're accounting for approval from the parents. For institutional review boards, we have to deal with these, and many of the awardees also have to deal with them. The number of focus group discussions and in-depth interviews, the trade-off of having a group that you discuss the problems or issue in and the interaction of the group versus a one-to-one in-depth interview. So if you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of in-depth interviews and talk one-on-one with each of the students, then maybe you can bring them in groups and think about what makes sense in selection of those who participate in the groups, the diversity you have in the group, and also have a good moderator. And depending on the group size, don't go too large groups to get enough information. And again, depending on the resources and timeline, how many groups you end up with to get the information. So it's a trade-off between which tools in the qualitative to use. Sometimes we try to do the semi-structured component at the beginning when you're greeting the focus group participants. So this way you don't keep them for a very long time and you keep it short and sweet and more focused on the main questions. So you get more, again, a mixed approach where you have some quantitative data structured questions, but you also have the more open-ended option of trying to understand problems and challenges and issues and talk more in depth about them. I'm not sure, Jen, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think I referenced that, and soon the Stevens Initiative is going to share some example focus group protocols. So for example, if a high school teacher is doing a virtual exchange for the first time, they could consider our focus group protocol, and we would highly, highly recommend that the teacher themselves not facilitate the focus group, that they ask a colleague to do it for them. And we have some introduction language which really explains to the focus group participants, in this case it might be high school students, how their perspective and their experience is really valuable and important, and that their teacher wants to learn about what they feel like they've gained, what they feel has worked well or not worked well, and really wants their feedback. And so we're going to take 30 minutes to have a group discussion. Please be candid and honest. I'm not going to report back specific comments to specific students, so you should feel comfortable sharing critical feedback, and that you were sort of the expert in this experience. So please let me learn from you so that I can share that with your teacher, because he or she is really committed to doing this as well as possible for next year's students, or something like that.
I mean, I'm not particularly, not directly involved in research at what you call K-12, is that? K-12 level secondary school. But there is, of course, there is a project, a big, again, Erasmus Plus funded project running on the other side of the big pond, the TECOLA project with its own website, TECOLA, and they specialize in running virtual exchanges at secondary level. They have a focus on language acquisition, but they also work across the curriculum. So I definitely direct you in that to check out that website. But I know that the biggest hurdle is GDPR, data protection, FERPA, I think it's in the US, and that therefore they have decided to go for case study research. Yeah, where you zoom in on the individual pairs or groups of students, 14, 15, 16 years old, and dig deeper because it's such a big challenge to get permission to work with them directly.
You've opened so many possible avenues for further discussion that we're starting to accumulate more questions than we can reasonably answer in the period of time. But there are a few concrete ones that I hope we can cover relatively quickly, give people an indication of possible directions they could follow. So if you could help me by giving the big points, and then we'll move on to more questions, that would be great. The first is about how to conduct or how to consider a virtual site visit. Jen, if you could say a word about that, and maybe Miriam, if that plays any role in what you all do, again, recognizing the value of seeing it in person, then that would be helpful for folks thinking about conducting virtual site visits to augment their in-person site visits.
Sure. So for the virtual site visits, we work with the program staff or leader. We'll have an introductory call explaining. We are hoping to do what we call site visit, and it's to do a few activities: interview the facilitator, conduct a focus group with participants, and observe an activity. And so what we do is say we can use we'll want to do that essentially through video conferencing. And we'll use whatever platform you use for your virtual exchange, if that's most familiar and comfortable for you. So if they do their exchange through Zoom, we propose doing it using Zoom. If it's Skype or Google Hangout, we kind of follow their lead on what technology they're most comfortable with. And then we work with our program point person to, when would be a good time to interview you? We would want about 30 minutes. Ideally, we interview you before we have the focus group with students, so that we have a good context for what we're gonna hear from about the program. And then, okay, what would be a good time to have a focus group with the students? Oftentimes they'll say, oh, we meet, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I could give you 45 minutes during our Thursday session. So again, we ask that they're sometimes they're naturally gathered in a classroom, and so we just ask that they're about 6 to 12, and that they're sitting in a way that we can see them. We confirm they can see and hear us, If they don't naturally gather in a classroom and they're going to be, you know, at home or at a cafe, we work with that as well. And then for the observation, if it is a synchronous activity, they're doing it online, and so we ask to join as an observer. And certainly the facilitator knows ahead of time, and we ask them that they tell the participants ahead of time, hey, there's these folks from RTI, they're going to be observing just to kind of learn about how we do things. They're not going to be noting your names, they're not going to be videoing you and putting it on YouTube. So we kind of go through all the same promises we make around anonymity. So it could, and then because we're working with the program point person, we're, you know, we've already sort of checked the platform they're going to use or we're going to use together. So, so that's how we approach it.
Mm-hmm. It is pretty much the same way we are doing it. So mirroring the approach that we use in training and implementation in terms of what tools we use to then carry out focus groups, interviews, and follow-ups. Zoom being, you've mentioned it, a very popular tool. Not the only one, but a very popular one. And then, of course, getting consent, the big issue, always getting consent to record and to transcribe. And then, as of late, also share and do collaborative research on the data that gets recorded and transcribed.
We had a question that asked more about the analysis software or the analysis programs that you mentioned. I think one was In Vivo, if I have that right, and one is Deduce. So we can make sure we share the specific names in the follow-up. But did you have it? What counsel or advice do you have, especially for smaller or newer programs, on whether to consider using these and how to use them maybe at a smaller scale?
Training and train together in your research team and train online and on-site. These are extremely complex data analysis packages, but once you know how to handle them, they do everything for you, your inter-rater reliability, etc. They calculate it and they throw it at you. And as I kept saying, they allow you to do matrix queries where you can combine parameters as you wish. So it is a steep learning curve. Yeah, it doesn't happen by the by. And I myself have been through 3 rounds of In Vivo basic training before I felt well equipped to do my own coding and not to mess up the project.
We looked into a few different programs, and I used In Vivo years ago for another project. I'm forgetting all the ones we considered for this project, but we went with Deduce. It's an online program, and it's not super expensive as I can't quote you the monthly fee, but if one, you don't have to buy like a whole year's subscription. I think you pay by month by user, and it's not terribly expensive. There are some video sort of learning tools, and my experience with it is that yes, it can do a lot, but it also can just do some sort of standard things, and you can just start with that and know, like, down the line I might want to understand this other feature, but here are the core things I can do with In Vivo, with Deduce, that really helps me organize my notes and documents.
And one thing just to keep in mind for those who are more used to quantitative research and trying to get into that component for qualitative, you have to be careful about the temptation to generalize or to provide counts and frequencies, because that could be a pitfall easily where you can fall in as you're writing reports. So even once you do the analysis and know how to use these software, you have to be very careful with the interpretation of the results and what they mean.
Thank you all for that.
Just so that you've mentioned them, there's also Atlas TI and ELAN. So they all do similar things. But if you're not a researcher in the first instance, like we are mostly practitioners who also do research, they do take a bit of time to learn and apply.
Thank you. There were several questions about how to set up and conduct the comparison groups or control groups that Safa mentioned at the beginning, and that's a great teaser to encourage you to go look at some past webinars we've run or other resources that we share. There's a reference to that, although it's brief, in the toolkit that we shared this morning and that we posted on the Stevens Initiative website resources page. It's a toolkit about overall evaluation methods used by the Stevens Initiative, so we encourage you to check there. And in that toolkit, there are links to much larger resources that can give you guidance about comparison or control groups. There were questions about what the sort of observations from these evaluations have been about effective practices for virtual exchange, and the Stevens Initiative is always working on sharing these effective practices through webinars and stories that we share, case studies, and so on. So it's a broader question that we don't have the space to try to answer here. So with an effort to wrap up a conversation about qualitative methods, we thought we would just pose one last question to our speakers to answer in just 1 minute to make sure we end on time. But if each of you could say a little bit more about what you're most excited to keep exploring through qualitative evaluation methods. What are the horizons that you see open before your programs right now and before the field that you think we'll all be exploring in the years ahead?
Shall I start? Because currently I'm delving into e-portfolios and collecting qualitative data through e-portfolios, and that can be anything and everything. That can be multimodal, that can be any artifact that gets created in the context of a virtual exchange. Why am I excited about this? Because I'm also a great believer in micro-credentialing and badges. And I know that badges link to evidence. Badges are, after all, only glorified URLs. And working with e-portfolios allows you to choose what do you want to be the evidence of what the badge testifies to. And we know that the analytics are available that allows future employers, for example, to find you if you have a bespoke skill and you have the evidence for that skill, and you will be able to integrate that into your digital signature. I see huge potential there. Hence, I think e-portfolios are the way forward.
For me, I'm excited about having those comparison groups and the impact evaluations components that are more rigorous, but also looking forward to potentially expand our target population for qualitative to include parents of students and community members to whom the students interact with, to see a fuller picture of what's going on. Right now, we're only looking at the educators, the awardees, and the students, so a very small environment, but we acknowledge that there's a larger community and a lot of other factors that could influence from the outside. So looking into that would be something great to do as a next step.
And what I'm most excited about, or at least what pops to mind first, is working with the Stevens Initiative to support dissemination of our findings that are largely coming from the qualitative research. As Henry alluded to, we have been identifying effective practices, including through our site visits. We share our findings with the Stevens Initiative through reports we submit to them that get shared with their funders and with the awardees, but we haven't yet done as much about disseminating to the wider field. So I'm looking forward to that, including potentially doing some sort of what we often call sense-making sessions and opening it up so that others sort of respond to what we say we think we're finding and have them agree or disagree or lift up other promising practices.
Dissemination. End of October, International Virtual Exchange Conference in Tacoma. Lots of people will be disseminating findings from research into virtual exchange.
Okay.
And join us.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar, both as attendees and as our presenters. We're so grateful that you shared and that you asked these questions to help us make sense of all of this. We will do what we can to pass along some final notes listing the resources that were mentioned and the opportunities as well, because Miriam was very enthusiastic to mention some of those opportunities to get involved. You can always go to the Stevens Initiative website, particularly the resources page, to find recordings of this and other webinars when we make them available. And we hope that you're on our list and keeping up with other opportunities to learn with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to our presenters. and have a great
You're
afternoon.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.